because we're consolidating two meetings. A lot of people aren't here because they were at the Tuesday meeting, but we're now getting a consolidated meeting every Saturday. And this meeting is intended to be the basis for an institution that can become a place where people can come and become empowered to be able to organize others, and get a sense of an in-depth perspective that otherwise you cannot get on the internet, or you cannot get in the press, and you cannot get, and also a chance to have a dialogue or interaction. So this is the first of these meetings that are going to be taking place, and every week we will have a strategic update, and then we will have a presentation that is prepared. It could be on history, it could be on science, it could be on philosophy, it could be on any number of very key aspects that are not presented in the population and are necessary for people to be able to carry out the political revolution that we are now engaged in creating. And tonight I want to introduce you to Dave Christie, who is a member of the policy committee, of the 6-member policy committee working with LaRouche. These are the 6 members who have formerly run for office, public office, run for Congress, run for Senate, in the case of Keisha Rogers in Texas. And they're in continuous deliberations about the changes that are going on, and a deliberation with Mr. LaRouche on how to proceed from a day-to-day basis. And tonight, Dave Christie will be going into the whole question of the last 39, 40 years of organizing that has created this incredible outbreak that is now taking place, where the most spectacular, unimaginable things are happening, where Russia is working with China. China is consolidating a complete strategic partnership with India. And most of the nations of the world are now regrouping around a survival strategy for humanity. And this was unthinkable a few months ago, but it was being prepared in the making, and it's been in the making for 39 years or so. And you will hear tonight from Dave Christie on how that process occurred. And we are taping this for our chapter in Vancouver, and we're taping it for other people as well. So you're not the only ones that are going to be listening to this. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dave Christie.
Guess we should move over a little bit here. Work or not, but okay. All right, so well, I think that idea that this is a forum by which we all become organizers and develop a capability to lead this country to join with what LaRouche has set into motion and has begun to consolidate. What is being called the BRICS has many phases of its evolution, and that's somewhat what I want to get into tonight. But we're in a moment of very profound crisis, obviously. The whole global financial system is set to explode. We have a lunatic in the White House named Barack Obama. He follows a long lineage of other lunatics, such as George Bush and his controller, Dick Cheney. As one of our associates down in Los Angeles said today, that don't worry, we're going to give Obama some good treatment. You know, we'll give him an outdoorsy type environment in prison. He can be in there with the two bushes. A little bit of a pun, but but that's true. They all should be in prison together. And these are the henchmen of a dying empire. Obama, the Bushes, so on, are the henchmen of a dying empire that is literally on the edge of complete disintegration. Now, they will not go down without a fight. And this is the British Empire. And by that, I mean the financial oligarchy out of London, its satellite offices in Wall Street and the European counterparts, in addition to the old European monarchies and others that have been brought into as a functional element. And we'll get into some of that tonight, but they are now going down because of what is being consolidated. Whereas Paul mentioned, nations around the world, and it's centered immediately in the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I'll just write it just for good measure. Have a sense of this, but handwriting is always so legible. But so these nations have come together. But when you're looking at this, it's really more the continent of Africa. In other words, South Africa may be a formal aspect of this, but as you'll see with some of the projects that are being unleashed, such as in Egypt, that you're creating the conditions where the entirety of the continent can come into a global development perspective. When you're looking at Brazil, with the inclusion of Argentina and as well what Bolivia is doing, you're really looking at South America. And as we'll see, Central America is now being included in the case of Nicaragua, and even now part of North America, which we often don't think of as Mexico as being part of North America, but it is. And we have an interesting way that this is now putting the pressure right up against the United States to put the question to the United States, where do you stand? Are you going to go down with the dying British Empire, or are you going to regain your heritage, or shall I say our heritage, in taking back this nation to its constitutional principles, which is not, we were never founded to be some empire to, as John Quincy Adams said, chase the monsters abroad, We were founded as a nation, and our intention was through a kind of economic and scientific development that we could bring all nations up. And that's what's being unleashed with these nations, which is by the time you start putting it together with all of the entities, we're looking at least half the world's population. But really, in terms of the countries coming on board, about 80% of the world is moving in this direction of economic development. Now, and I'll just sort of reference a few things, just things that have popped up in the recent days. You have this is in the recent period right now, and I'll refer to some of this, but the second canal, right, through Nicaragua, through this lake that's right in the middle, which would be like a second Panama Canal. You have today what they call a dry canal. This was announced. I know that the president of Mexico is going to meet with the president of China on a dry canal that would be, a rail line that would connect the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Basin. You have the second Suez Canal, which is in construction now in Egypt. That's being financed by Egyptian dollars. And a whole slew of economic development through this way under the banner of the Silk Road. Okay, so this is what is now consolidating and is part of a fight that LaRouche has waged over a 40-year period. Now, this perspective of the BRICS nations, and I just want to just geographically, I think it's important. That's Brazil with 205 million people, I believe. Russia, about 140 or maybe 170 million. I think it's actually 140 million. India, 1.25 billion. China, 1.3, 1.4 billion. South Africa is a smaller nation, but if you begin to look at this as a land mass and as a population mass, just between China and India alone, you have a third of the world's population. And they're coming together around these great projects, but more importantly, they're coming together around an idea of the nature of man. And I think that this was probably most eloquently brought out by Narendra Modi, who is the Prime Minister of India. Okay, now, I think it was on Thursday, was the 145th birthday or anniversary of the birthday of Gandhi. Okay, so what Modi did is launched a Clean India campaign. Okay, and in addition to that, he is alluding to the concept that he's going to get rid of the caste system, which is a big deal. This is a long plague on the Indian people's back. But more importantly, this quality that what he's saying to the Indian people as well is not, oh, we're going to clean up the poor areas, right? He's talking about getting public sanitation everywhere, like a toilet, and which may not sound, it sort of sounds strange to us, the idea that we wouldn't have public sanitation, but in India you don't. And imagine what that does to you if you see your fellow citizens or you yourself are out, in the gutters behind the streets or whatever, having to relieve yourself there. I mean, it creates a mindset where you don't quite feel fully human. So this is what Modi is committed to, is to cleaning this up. But he's also saying that he says we have to look at our strengths as who we are as Indians. And they just launched, they're the first nation to actually have done this, where they put a satellite in orbit around Mars on the first go-round. We have other nations that have done it. You have the United States, China, and Russia have all put a satellite up around Mars, but they were the first one to do it on the first shot. And Modi, somewhat polemically, actually, it's been noted that the budget that he did that on was less than the Hollywood movie Gravity, which is about $100 million to put that movie together. I haven't even seen it yet, but okay. Jenny verified it's stupid. But what Modi did, I think, is very telling. He says, for the price of a rickshaw, to get hauled around by some guy that's carrying you on a rickshaw, that the trip, if you would have paid somebody on a rickshaw to take you all the way to Mars, it was actually cheaper to do it the way that India did it, which is, I think, very polemical. But the point is, he's making, if we can do that, we can clean up India. We can bring a sense of dignity, and we can do these great projects, because one of the arguments in the United States for shutting down NASA was it costs too much. Why are we sending people up into onto the moon when we have poor people around? Well, real economics teaches that when you make the qualitative breakthroughs in your scientific capability and you apply that to technologies, you create a new capability for there to be more abundance and more capability to solve the crisis with your poor people. So the fact is that Modi is getting this and is pursuing this is an indication that these world leaders are getting this in a much more profound way. They're actually coming to grasp what LaRouche has been fighting really as a sole warrior against the various forms of economics that really aren't scientifically based, whether it be communism, socialism, capitalism, so-called capitalism, really British free trade, imperial economics. None of this is scientifically based. But what you're getting from these leaders is the beginning that this is, we're on the edge of a new paradigm, that we can consolidate a grouping of nations that come together as sovereign nations that have the common interests of mankind at heart. It is not simply a national interest, but rather you see embedded within your nation humanity as a whole, and you're really fighting for humanity as a whole, but you're doing it in the venue of your own nation, your own culture, your own ideas, your own language, poetry, etc., music. So this is a very profound moment, but I can guarantee you the Queen of England, her consort, Prince Philip, the other monarchs of Europe, and their London banking establishment are not going to let this go down without a fight. And so just in the recent days, there's been a few assassination threats that should be taken seriously. Actually, one of them was with Modi, and we don't have all the details exactly at this point, but apparently while Modi was in the United States, he has a backup Boeing 747 that is his, Air Force One equivalent. And they found a diffused explosive device, like basically a grenade that would have been where he was. And so apparently it's been cleared, and went out, it didn't go off or anything like that. But we're not exactly clear what this was, if this was a legitimate thing or just a scare, or perhaps even the Indian security officials who were doing a test. It could have been any one of these things, but these are the kind of things that we should expect. The assassination threat to Cristina Kirchner of Argentina is perhaps more explicit. And what she did is very interesting, because she said, look, they tried to claim that the ISIS was going to go after her, the Islamic State grouping, right? Which is a little bit just absurd to even think about. But she says, look, if something happens to me, don't look to the Middle East, look to the North, meaning look to the United States. And what she is referring to is somewhat of a long saga, and the State Department came out with a fairly hysterical denial. Oh, this is just completely, we don't even have to take this seriously. Why is she even saying this? We have no interest in this, or we're not even going to take it seriously. Reality is, there's been a long history of U.S. subversion in South America. And I'll come back to it a little bit, but Operation Condor, which was being run, which was the overthrow of various governments during the 70s and so forth. The installation of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, that was probably the most famous one. But the assassinations and subversion were a factor of U.S. The CIA activities under the control of the British Empire, under the control of the global imperial structure that wanted to maintain their economic control, the control of the multinational cartels and international banks. So that's that her concerns are part of a larger attack on this whole BRICS process, of which Argentina is coming more and more into the fold to be a part of this network, and to be a part of these nations that are actually pushing for development. Now, her nation is under attack presently by the vulture funds, the Wall Street. These vulture funds are basically, they come in and they bought up Argentinian state bonds between 2001 and 2003, after they had a financial crisis. They bought up these state bonds. They did not agree to the terms of renegotiation that happened in 2005, where Argentina took all bondholders together and said, look, we can't pay these in the present confines. And this was actually done under her husband, Nestor Kirch. Okay, so they brought the bondholders together and said, we can't meet these terms of payments, but we'll work out a new arrangement so that you'll get your money. Well, these vulture funds weren't present at that meeting. And now here they are, you know, in some cases 13 years after they bought the bonds, and they want full payment for these bonds now, which would gut and destroy Argentina. And a U.S. judge out of New York has ruled that Argentina is now in contempt of court for not agreeing to pay for this. Okay, so there's a reason why there is an assassination threat levied at her. But it's in the context of many nations that are now under the gun with these BRICS nations. Obviously, we all know what happened with Russia, right? There was the coup in Ukraine, backed by the State Department, that brought in a bunch of neo-Nazis to take over the Ukrainian government and to run a provocation against Russia to provoke them into war. And I think, you know, the point on why, okay, I somewhat didn't go exactly with the idea that I initially had planned, but where this war drive is coming from in terms of why they would be pushing this against Russia actually comes back to what happened in 2009, where China and India came together and said that we are not going to play along with the British Empire's game of the environmentalism. And I want to show a very special picture here. Some of you have probably seen it. Okay, I don't know if that's very visible. Oh. Okay, so people familiar with the World Wildlife Foundation? Okay, it's sort of the umbrella group for all the environmentalist organizations, and this is the husband of Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip. He was the one that founded the organization back in the 60s. But what the Queen of England demanded in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit was that all nations that were there were going to sign up to end their industrial advancement. They were going to agree that carbon dioxide was the cause of all human evils on the planet and shut down their industries. And what happened is China and India said, no, we're not going along with it. And you had unleashed the beginning of a war that was to be spread in the Arab Spring that began in northern Africa, and that was to be spread all the way along the obviously tensions between Pakistan and India. But that was to be spread all the way along the underbelly of Russia and China, and as well against India. And so you saw the war in Libya unleashed, and immediately after the death of Gaddafi, LaRouche warned that the next step would be into Syria and Iran as to set a staging ground for the war against Russia and eventually China. Okay, so that was in 2009. Now, what this was directed at was what later became the BRICS, but it was also directly, the war was directed directly at China and India for not going along with the climate change agenda, for saying, no, we're going to stick to our guns on this economic development. Now, there were other elements that were leading into some conception that there was going to be a new economic order. One, which I find very interesting, I didn't realize that in 2007, Vladimir Putin had actually called for a new just economic system, or a new financial architecture, or something along those lines, in 2007 at the St. Petersburg International Forum. But all of this goes back to what LaRouche had done in 1975. And LaRouche had called back then for the creation of an international development bank. Okay, now what this was coming out of was in 1971, you had the ending of the Bretton Woods system, which was a system that actually promoted economic development and a kind of level playing field for nations after the end of World War II. Okay, so this was created around the same time that the UN and the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank were part of the Bretton Woods discussion. And what Roosevelt intended with the Bretton Woods system was that, or the discussions there, that the UN and the IMF and so forth were to actually be a means by which nations could develop. That after the war was over, which Roosevelt had very direct fights with Churchill, saying that once the war was over, so was the colonial slavery, right? That he had very direct fights with Churchill, saying, look, we didn't fight a war against fascist economic slavery in Germany so that you guys could continue your fascist economic slavery with the colonial system. And so what the Bretton Woods system was to be was that you would provide a fixed exchange rate. So if you were a nation and you wanted to take out a long-term loan, you could develop and know that you could pay that loan back over a 20, 30-year period, and that the currency was going to be relatively stable in that process. And so when in 1971, Nixon broke with that system, and that created the conditions where the IMF turned into a tool of London and Wall Street to force a kind of debt slavery on nations all around the world. They did this in South America in particular, and the idea was you would get loans from the IMF. You would be one of these nations to get loans. And in the process of paying the loans back, because there was no more of a fixed exchange rate and you had a floating exchange rate, then the currency speculators could actually drive the price of your currency down, and you would end up paying loans over and over and over. You created a kind of endless debt spiral where they never actually got on top of it to make the payments, right? And so in this period, LaRouche came out and said, we need to get rid of the IMF. We need to bring the International Development Bank together so that it can do what it should have been, what the IMF was supposed to be created for, to get loans for economic development for these nations. And now, a year later, in 1976, you had the non-aligned movement, which were a lot of the nations such as India and others, that were not necessarily aligned with any of the major power blocks. Right? They weren't with the Soviet or the communist system. They weren't with the NATO structure. They were saying, well, we're going to keep a non-aligned status. And the leadership of the non-aligned movement, which included people like Indira Gandhi, became very close friends with LaRouche. Okay, so now they basically adopted this concept. In 1976, there was a meeting they had in Colombo, I think Sri Lanka, was it? Yeah. And okay, so yeah, so they came forward saying that we needed to have this International Development Bank perspective. Then a year, actually, it was that same year, you had a guy that eventually became an organizer for us, a guy named Fred Wills, who was the foreign minister of Guyana. And at the time, he stood up at the United Nations and said that we needed debt moratorium, which is one of the things that LaRouche was calling for. That all these nations that had been under the grip of this debt slavery, that they would be freed from that, that you would have a debt moratorium and they wouldn't have to pay back these loans, these usurious loans that were keeping them beat down. And so that was, that was in 1976. I'm sorry, I'm having one of these moments where it's like I had a whole idea, and now that idea I've lost the grip of it. And so I'm sort of just feel like I'm saying words, but that there's nothing behind it. I don't know if any of you have gone through that situation, but that's where I'm at right now.
No, correct.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like you have one idea, and then I probably should just take the notes and chuck them. Look, where we're at right now is what Lynn did with this was to bring the hammer down on the British Empire. And they have done the same thing that they've done since time immemorial, which is use finance, use usury, which is just simply a way to say, yeah, you want some money? Well, we'll give you the money, but you got to give us the pound of flesh. You've got to, I own you by making you my debt slave. That's what usury is, right? That's been the fight since the beginning of human existence. And what Lynn did with this is he saw what the British Empire had done. The whole thing in 1971 was they wanted to wipe out a capability for humanity to develop. They have said it since the get-go, what Prince Philip, the monarchies, they have always argued and, or I shouldn't say argued, their view is that there are too many human beings on this planet. They would prefer to go back to a much more manageable number, say about 1 billion peasants, just enough to shine the shoes and tend the gardens and grow enough food that the oligarchs can sit around and, exist. But what they know is that if you have any more population than that, what do you have to have? You have to have a scientific capability, right? So what happens when you have a scientific capability? You have people that can think. And so they have always sought to keep down human population. And what they intended to do in 1971, when they broke with or they got rid of the Bretton Woods system, was they were going to take the reins back from a world that had been initiated by Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, that was a world where he was going to get rid of the colonial system, just as he had wiped out fascism, right? And that world vision that Roosevelt had of development and his realization that if you had real economic development, you could pull humanity all up, and that was actually going to be how you bring peace amongst nations. Now, that view was also shared by John F. Kennedy. That view was shared by people around Europe as well. That view was shared by people in South America. So there was this movement that had been consolidated after the death of FDR, which the British Empire wanted to crush. Okay, so what happened in 1971 didn't just happen in 1971. They had to do a series of steps to get there. Number one was the wave of assassinations, right? Kennedy was killed, his brother Robert was killed, Martin Luther King, who they saw as a huge threat because of what he represented as a moral and philosophical outlook, and probably, had he not been killed, may have become our first black president instead of Barack Obama. You know, that was where things were going. Now, at the same time they were knocking off the leadership of the United States, they were doing the same thing in Europe. That's what I mentioned with this Operation Gladio, right? You had Aldo Moro assassinated. You had certain industrialists and banking networks inside of Germany that were targeted by this. Some of these people, was Herrhausen back then, or was that it was later? Yeah,
Enrico Mattei was big.
Right. Enrico Mattei out of
the Seven Sisters.
So there was this whole grouping that was coming together and saying, you know, that we're continuing this tradition that they were going to get rid of this the British imperial system, wipe it out for good, and they were targeted for assassination. Allende of Chile was overthrown. Also, I think eventually assassinated, maybe he's just overthrown. But anyway, they brought in assassinated. They brought in Pinochet for a brutal dictatorship. You know, so that's the context by which they came in, and they knocked out this Bretton Woods system, so that they could bring in the debt slavery system. And this is what Lynn said no. And LaRouche, he had seen what the British system represented, right? He had seen this when he was in India during the war. He saw the independence movement that was developing in India, and the response by the British was literally, in some case, they had a massacre that Lynn witnessed, actually. So he saw what the brutality of the British Empire actually was, and his commitment was to crush this thing. Okay, so this was the call that he put out in 1975, the call for an international development bank. Now, here we are 40 years later, and that call has been answered. This was in July of this year in Brazil. The BRICS nations came together and created the new development bank as a direct echo of what Lynn had done back in 1975. Okay, so I just want to go through a few things that get into this. Well, one of the things, I think one of the key nations that we're now seeing, like with what India is doing now, what Modi has done, I mean, you got to realize when you have Modi, the Prime Minister of India, coming out directly and calling attention to the British Empire, right? In his recent speech, he says, "I'm the first Prime Minister that was born not under the British era." Okay, he says that I'm the first Prime Minister born where my first breaths were that of democracy, which was not under the slavery. I was not under the slave system, right? So he's basically saying, I'm the first Prime Minister that wasn't born under the British slave system. That's a pretty big deal to equate that the British era was the slave system. So, and, in that same spirit, what Kirchner has been saying recently is, she says, look, what these vulture funds are doing inside of Argentina, she says, we're in a kind of a pinchers right now, where the speculators are on one side, the grain cartels on the other. They're trying to crush this nation. And this is the same kind of threat that this is similar to the British warships coming in the 1800s, right? So the fact is, you've got these world leaders of these BRICS nations and the others that are coming into this economic development that are directly identifying that this is the British imperial system. And that's important because it starts to get to the root cause of what this system actually is, a view of man, a view of this degraded slave system. So, but this is what LaRouche had sought to destroy. And so we're at a point now where with the new development bank, you have the direct echo of what Lynn did with the International Development Bank. One of the key figures that took that on was Indira Gandhi. Okay, she personally met with LaRouche and his wife, Helga. Hold on one second here. I'm just gonna. Oh, you know what? Okay, I guess I didn't have that one up there, but she personally met Lynn and Helga. Yeah, that's actually later. I think it's 2001. Yeah, in I think it was 1982. Okay, so LaRouche addressed the Indian Council of World Affairs. So he just, yeah, there's, well, okay, so he met with Indira Gandhi in 1982, and who, you know, was the Prime Minister of India at the time. He immediately went to Mexico to meet with Jose Lopez Portillo. Now, what LaRouche proposed with Jose Lopez Portillo, as he was doing with a number of these other nations, was the concept of the debt bomb. That what you would have is these indebted nations that were up to their gills in, you know, these usurious loans from the IMF, that they would band together and say, you know, nations of South America, nations of these non-aligned movements would band together and say, we can't make these payments. Your demands, you know, at one point, I think Lynn had just made or just the concept is you are under this, the IMF system, you increase the obligations of these nations to pay the debt while reducing the variability for them to make the payments. In other words, part of making the payments of the IMF system is you say, okay, well, you can't pay it. We'll restructure your debt. We'll roll it over. You can take on a new loan, but it comes with austerity. You know, it comes with collapsing living standards for your people. It comes with our ability to come in and loot and steal your raw materials. And so at a certain point then, these nations, their very means by which to make the payments doesn't exist. They're killing themselves as they try to make the payments, and so of course then they can't make the payments, and they have to get into further level of debt slavery in this system. So what Lynn said is, bring these nations together and enact a debt bomb. Okay, so the idea is you basically come together and you just say, we're not paying. And we demand that we're going to set the terms of agreements on these payments. This is very much like what Argentina did in about 2005, I believe it was, under Cristina Kirchner's husband, where he just came together and said, you know, we don't accept these terms of agreement, and we're going to renegotiate how we make the payments of these bonds. Actually, I like what he says. Just to fast forward a few years here. As an echo that you see, this is from 2005. This is the husband of Cristina Kirchner, who was president of Argentina from 2000 I think it was, to 2007. He died in office. Probably was, his death was hastened along. I'll just say that. He was fairly young when he died. I think he was in his 50s. But anyway, what he did is he made a call for the end of or a return to the Bretton Woods system, a return to this pre-1971 system, where you would go back to a fair and equitable system. And he says, concerning his own debt renegotiation in 2005, he says, there is life after the IMF. There's life after this system. He says, and it's a very good life. And remember, being in the embrace of the IMF isn't exactly like being in heaven. I received in Argentina devastated by an economic program supported by the International Monetary Fund. The placing of private interests over the general interests was the expression of a specific model of society which led to generalized poverty, uncertainty, isolation, and impoverishment of life at all levels. As it operates today, the IMF has no future, and the developed world has to understand this. Argentina is prepared to work actively and constructively on behalf of a new world economic order. So 2005 Kirchner was echoing what LaRouche had been calling for since the creation of the International Development Bank and that whole concept. And what he did with Argentina was very similar to what LaRouche was calling for with this debt bomb idea, is that you bring these nations together, you say, screw off to the IMF, we're not paying you, we set the terms of payment. And what LaRouche was calling for was that they also say, and here are the terms of agreement for a new just world economic model. Okay, so that was the direction that things were moving. Since the late 70s on into the early 80s, LaRouche met with Indira Gandhi in 1982. You had the non-aligned movement basically moving in this direction. And Jose Lopez Portillo had gone with one of LaRouche's, or was moving with LaRouche's economic program. He nationalized the banks in Mexico. He was, I think, nationalized the oil industry as well. And then things blew up. And you had the assassination of Indira Gandhi. This was in 1984, October 31st, so just about 30 years ago. And LaRouche put this out. He says, this morning at 9:18 a.m. New Delhi time, assassins of a London-based terrorist cult murdered one of the greatest world leaders of our generation, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. My wife and I, who loved her dearly, cannot find words adequate to express our personal grief. If India is destabilized as a result of this assassination, the effects could become quickly as dangerous as the murder of the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, the incident which triggered World War I. Now, 3 days before she was assassinated, Indira Gandhi said, if I were to die serving my country, I would be very proud. I feel I have to fight evil. I have to fight what is wrong, but you cannot be bothered about what is happening to you in consequence. You have to go on with your job. So I think she had a sense that that was her, that was coming. Okay, so the point is, Lynn had put this on the table over, well, about 40 years ago in terms of the new development bank, or the International Development Bank as it was called that time. You had then program after program being laid out of what, not just what the International Development Bank would be, but what the economic program that goes along with it. And this is one pamphlet that we put out on the, I don't know if you guys can see that so well, but on the industrialization of India. This is a plan that LaRouche had put out. I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was early 80s. Now, this one here, which I think was the India report was 1980, and this is 1983. So now I found it extremely fascinating that there were 3 major projects in this, which has to do with the Indian Pacific Ocean basin. Obviously, that's the whole mix here. The first project was the Nicaragua Canal, which is now in construction, or the beginning of it moving. The second one was the expansion of the Suez Canal, which is now, dirt is being moved just within the recent period, almost since the Fortaleza summit in Brazil, when the BRICS nations came together and created the new development bank, which was their way of saying, look, we're going for it. We're going for the full perspective. And the full LaRouche perspective, I think it should be clear if you kind of just, I encourage people, I'll let you know where I'm getting some of this material, but people should go through it. It's quite astounding, the level of movement with LaRouche's program. So that was the first one, the Nicaragua Canal. Second one, the expansion of the Suez Canal. And the third is the Craw Canal. Okay, so that means rather than coming from China and having to go all the way to Singapore and then back up and then over this way, you know, whether you want to go to the Suez Canal or to India, instead you could come just straight through there, you know, and across. Okay, now in the week leading up to the recent UN General Assembly, China and India met, and one of the discussions that they had was on the maritime Silk Road, right? So you have the Silk Road, which is the land portion of it is a network of high-speed rail that ultimately would be crisscrossing the entirety of Eurasia. But then you have the maritime Silk Road, which the Silk Road obviously harkens back to the old trade routes. Now, something that we don't have much of a reading on, but if you begin to put this together as all these economic projects that are now just piling on top of each other one by one, that's how you're going to create the conditions for peace amongst nations. You know, that's what you do. You say, look, your interest is in my interest is in your interest, so let's cooperate on this economic development. Now, I don't know much more other than the headline news on the matter, but apparently the North Koreans sent a fairly high-level delegation to South Korea, I guess today. So this could also be, because if you think of what a rail link would do from South Korea to be able to go up through North Korea and into China, up through the Trans-Siberian Railroad, over to Europe. This would just create a whole new capability that would benefit South Korea massively, but more importantly, it would pull North Korea out of the conditions of poverty and, you know, somewhat general insanity. You know, there may be reasons for it, but it's been a bit of a wacky government for some time. And it's also one of the hot spots that can be manipulated for the larger war agenda. You could chill out those tensions, which would also ease the tensions with Japan and be able to bring Japan in, which unfortunately has historically gone along with the British Empire agenda. And if Japan were brought in, you could isolate what the Obama administration has tried to do, which is the so-called Asia pivot, right? Which is the buildup of military bases all throughout Australia and the Philippines, and the attempt, which is obviously the direction is towards China as part of this World War agenda. It also would, the unification of North and South Korea in the context of all this other economic development, it would throw Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership out the window, which is the way to the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the United States working with Vietnam, the Philippines, I think it was Chile, Peru, but no mention of Russia, India, China. If you're going to talk about the Pacific Basin or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the idea that you're not trading with these nations should be very clear who's actually the target of isolating trade with these nations. So this is part of the larger war push by Obama and his controllers, who are out to knock out this growing, emerging, developing economic orientation. So but the point is, I mean, these projects that we see in this has been 30, 40 years in the making. Okay, numerous fights to get this thing moving. Actually, at the time that this was proposed, and one of the advocates of the International Development Bank concept and the debt bomb and working with Jose Lopez Portillo, one of the advocates was at the time the president of Nicaragua, a guy named Daniel Ortega. Okay, now guess who the president of Nicaragua is right now? Daniel Ortega. So, so these are, so I guess what I'm trying to get at, and maybe we could just open it up for some discussions if there's anything that's not clear, but what is now unfolding has been 40 years in the works. And some of the people that have moved on these projects or are the ones directly that were working with us back then. In the case of Daniel Ortega, I can't vouch for how close he was to Lynn, but it's clear that he's open to the programs that we were laying out. Actually, that Nicaragua canal, apparently it comes from a Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers program that goes back to 1905. And I guess Ortega, when he was discussing it, was holding it up. I think it was on the UN, in the United Nations, or anyway. But so these are people. LaRouche, when he went back to India in 2001, this is he and his wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Okay, that's a little too big. So that's LaRouche, his wife, Helga. I'm not sure if Helga wanted to dress up like that or if that's just a cultural, She wanted to. Anyway, but Lynn actually had met when this was 2001, when he was laying forward some of the economic policies that India is now moving on. He had actually met with a couple of the former prime ministers. This guy is Chandra Shekhar and I.K. Gujral. So anyway, so I mean, the point is, these are people and concepts and ideas that have been fought for 40 years now. And they're now coming together because the reality is this system is dead. It was not designed for human beings, and therefore it's lawful that it collapse. It is now sinking, and what you're getting is, because of the consistent battle of Lynn, there's a pathway out of this crisis, and these nations are now moving on it, and it's growing. It's taking on a life of its own that is actually elevated. That it's not just some projects. It's not just a way for some people to make some money or something like that. It's actually rooted in the concept of man that we're, like what Gandhi represented. It's not. We're going to pull people out of this existence of poverty. We're gonna elevate them to a true human status. That's what's actually going on with these nations. So I think I'm just going to leave it there. It was somewhat a little jumbled up, but that's just the way sometimes it goes. So maybe we'll might be a part of a continuing series, just because there's a lot to go through and it's difficult to sort of distill it. So, but if there's anything that people want to add or any questions.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things. I joined the movement a year before this whole process started, and I was there the whole time. And how to put it? There were obviously forces in the United States that supported, because he could not have done what he did if there weren't forces in the United States that supported. But they had been decimated by the assassination of Kennedy King, the two Kennedys and King. They had been a continuation of what FDR and what had been the best of Kennedy. So those forces that were embedded in the U.S., which were not the forces that were in power necessarily, were definitely supportive of LaRouche, I do believe. And LaRouche was a way of